Okay, hi. Today I want to talk to you about metaphysics and behaviorism, which really might seem like a kind of strange combination. By metaphysics, I mean the general question as to what sort of categories of existence there are. So what could that mean? Well, some basic examples, I'll just give two. One would be if you thought that God existed and God was different from the universe. So you think that something exists that's God and something else exists as the universe. So there are two basic categories of existence, different kinds of things. And so the second one, the one we're talking about today is, for example, the mind-body distinction, which is often seen as a metaphysical distinction. And I think I can show you today why even today in the year 2021, we can still see that there are metaphysical issues. That's part of the reason why I'm making this video. And the other one that I was talking about before is this, that we don't usually associate behaviorism and in general empiricism with these kinds of metaphysical questions. And yet today we find, I think, the empiricist tradition squarely in the middle of a sort of metaphysical revival. And so that's part of what I want to explain. But really what I want, most of the people watching this video are going to really be more interested in finding out what exactly is it about empiricist approaches in terms of the philosophy of mind? What are the implications of empiricist approaches to the theory of mind? Okay, so I have a couple notes here. I did want to mention a couple reasons why we really don't have a lot of this discussion, which is why I thought it would not be a good idea to make a video about it. For one thing, in some humanist circles, behaviorism has kind of a bad reputation. So in some sort of history of philosophy classes, history of psychology classes, you might find that you're taught that behaviorism is kind of really bad reactionary thing. Noam Chomsky was notoriously concerned about the dehumanizing attitude of behaviorism. And I think there are legitimate concerns. I think a lot of people in experimental psychology who have essentially behavioristic approaches don't address those concerns, but maybe those people are trying to do a kind of experimental scientific work where it isn't their concern. But this is exactly what we want to talk about. So first of all, then, behaviorism has a kind of bad reputation, I find, as a humanities teacher, undergraduates. That's what I am, it gets to be sort of a whipping post for for these kind of supposedly reductive aspects of it. Secondly, though, and I think actually this is really more important, there are a lot of other kinds of misinterpretations of behaviorism on the side of people who think that behaviorism is a good thing. Misinterpretations about the implications of behaviorism, for example, for making mental attributions to non-linguistic animals, speaking of Noam Chomsky, and other issues. And so I think that it's actually people who accept too glibly some sort of wrong implications of behaviorism, or maybe actually people making a bigger mistake than people who dismiss behaviorism as some kind of reductive or reactionary empirical tendency. What the heck? Oh yeah, and the last thing, I'll put those away. And the last thing is this, that empiricism in general, starting with who I take to be the sort of ultimate empiricist is David Hume, it always sort of saw itself as doing away with philosophy, the English metaphysics, that is speculative metaphysics, as Hume would have called it. And this Anglo tradition, the English language tradition of philosophy, has really had that attitude towards metaphysics as a piece of rhetoric for a long time. So it's both ironic and I think in some ways got a little bit under the radar that the English language philosophers over the last 50 years have really worked themselves into a very major revival of what can only be seen as classical and early modern metaphysics. And so that's a real big undertow here as our superficial purpose. The real reason here is to get a better handle on empiricist approaches to psychology and particularly behaviorism. And then there is this larger underlying issue of empiricism and metaphysics in general. So, all right, so let's start sharing the screen. Whatever that is. Large that. I'm still trying to figure out. All right. So, right, behaviorism and the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem, typically taken to mean sort of the metaphysics of the mind-body problem, at least in current philosophical parlance. and then the subtitle there, Empiricism and the Metaphysics of Psychology. So saying things about psychology, but also having a look at, say some empiricism as well. I do find that there are sort of people who have a lot of kind of ideological or partisan sort of thoughts about this. And I just think that doing that kind of meta philosophy is really kind of premature. But anyway, I'm going to not mention that again. Okay, so empiricism, first of all, let me just take you through it. I appreciate that these have kind of a lot of, it's a little wordy. I'm really assuming that you don't, I'm assuming that you have a little bit and that you're smart, but that you really want this to be explained to you in a respectful manner. Basically, that's what I'm doing here. So you have David Hume, Enlightenment. The Enlightenment thinkers, remember the French Revolution is 1789. The Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century calling themselves that because they think this light of scientific reason and an end to superstition is kind of lighting up the world, and they're seeing the world in a new light. They see themselves as radicals. And then technically you had the rationalist mathematician Descartes in the 17th century, and we know that in his meditations he tells us all these skeptical problems, and it turns out he thinks he really doesn't know really anything except there's something that thinks. And Hume, for one thing, notice we have a way that we look at this in terms of philosophical methodology. We have a language that we use, and we have this verb to know, and we talk about knowing things. And if a philosopher shows up and says, well, actually, we don't know anything. I mean, for one thing, philosophy is about sort of understanding things. Philosophy isn't really about changing things. People always think that the philosophers must be like engineers or something, that they're going to find some problem and fix it. But that's, and then well, how come they never fix anything? But that's a misconception of what's going on here. One of the things that is going on here is looking at these concepts. For example, the concept of knowledge. What is knowledge? The mathematician has a much too strict criterion of knowledge. Too strict for what? Too strict to fit the way we ordinarily use the word, right? That's the thing. So one basic issue here is that maybe being reasonable is not the same thing as being rational. All right, so second bullet point. And so what is empiricism? And David Hume says all knowledge is based on experience. Knowledge is produced through observation or experience. Experience is the operative word in the middle of all of this. Intersubjectively repeatable. I can make the observation, you can make it or fail to see it. It's democratic. It comes up with democracy in this 18th century. And so last sentence there on the slide, this epistemological principle is more basic to modern science than any metaphysical discussion. We're here today to really talk about metaphysics, but we're talking about empiricism. And people think of empiricism as an epistemological doctrine, which it is. Hume has an epistemological doctrine at the middle of his philosophy, very systematic, and that is that knowledge is produced by experience. And that is, so we call it empirical science, observational science. Control the variables, have repeated nice big fat data sets, and hopefully have someone else checking. And notoriously, that doesn't happen as much as it should. The accompanying metaphysical naturalism has more problems than empiricism itself. So empiricism is an epistemological idea that knowledge is based on experience. What naturalism, I guess, is a kind of monist idea that the only thing that exists is nature, and there's no dualism, really, is the point. So, but again, that's something, you can question our grounds for making assertions like that. Hume, again, didn't really like metaphysics much. And if you said to Hume, the desk is here and it's really real, and you pound it on the desk like that, Hume would say, yes, but excuse me, that last part when you said, and it's really real and pounded on the desk was just superfluous. It added nothing, because when you say the desk is here, what you mean is you're having this experience. And so a metaphysical movement that called itself the realists said that they were asserting that somehow the world was really real. Again, whatever they could possibly mean by that, if they meant anything other than that we were making our assertions based on our experiences, they would be adding something else. That's a hopeless project. So So bearing that in mind, and that Humean refusal, for example, to countenance realism, if realism is just a sort of announcement that you believe in something for which you have no further grounds than your ordinary experiential grounds, right? So it looks like it's going to be hard to make some metaphysical points here, but we can. There are deep metaphysical issues going on here, so let's take a look at them. First of all, let's move to our area here, psychology. Now, Hume says, for example, in Hume's chapter on miracles, Hume does some real language philosophy there. He says, let's say that a belief is an habituation, an expectation about the future based on past experiences, and that is what he calls it, and that is full-blown behaviorism, full-blown, as I say there in the first bullet point. Okay, so it's all kind of there in David Hume. All right, so on miracles, then he says, well, then if you define a law of nature as just a really strongly confirmed belief, again, remember, he's not a realist. He's not making some sort of metaphysical assertion about the reality. It's far from a science groupie, right? He's not saying anything about the authority of science. He is talking about the authority of experience. Okay. So let's look at the second bullet point, behaviorism. Then the strategy of behaviorism and modern behaviorism, right, is just to, at the beginning of the 20th century, the question is, you want to make psychology scientific. So how do you do it? So one really direct way of doing that is, well, we are just going to hew to scientific methodology. There are sort of two different topics here that often get confused. That is sort of behaviorism, as we're talking about it in sort of the experimental psychology community, where serious scientists are trying to do serious research work. And there they would say, a lot of them would call themselves behaviorists just because they have a strong commitment to these empiricist values as researchers, as investigators. And really the rest of the discussion that the philosophers have is something they don't necessarily need to be concerned. I would be the first to agree, other than, of course, the ethical aspects of their own work, which everyone always needs to worry about. So you can do that, and you can be sort of agnostic about what you might call, I guess, the humanistic side of psychology. Behaviorism and practice psychology along empiricist lines. Again, this is a practice from the early 20th century. And the problem is this, so just in a nutshell, the behaviorists, let me just, I'll step out for this for a second because this is an important one. This is about as far as most people get with behaviorism in terms of undergraduate introductions to sort of the history of psychology. And it would be something like this, that say, take pain, all right? So we're gonna make a psychological description about someone that they're in pain. And the behaviorist, it looks like, since the behaviorist says that these psychological attributions, really what they refer to really are these observable sets of dispositions to behave. So pain then is going to be something like wincing, crying, saying, hey, I'm in pain. Maybe, also behaviorists love stuff like galvanic skin response. And, you can see physiological things happening too. So all that kind of stuff. What an ordinary person would say, and I think correctly, is that all of those behaviors are caused by a certain kind of experience, the sensation of pain. That is the phenomenal experience of pain. Pain as a quality of experience, of subjective phenomenal experience. And it's that feeling is the reason why we're wincing and crying and verbally reporting we're in pain and so on and so forth. That seems intuitive to most people, including myself, certainly. I think it's right. So as I said, though, that's about as far as people are going to get with a lot of introductions to behaviorism. If you're getting it in a sort of humanities context, and we're talking about the history of psychology, and maybe the ideology or philosophy of psychology along the way, then that's sort of we get Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, right? Where we're going to shock the little working class kids if they go to the flowers, so they'll go over to the tools. This was his attack on behavior modification. This was what Noam Chomsky didn't like about behaviorism, that in ignoring the inner the quality of phenomenal experience, behaviorism is dehumanizing. I think that's an essential criticism of behaviorism. And I think it's a trenchant one. And again, I think the way I would put it is it shows why behaviorism never really had any serious chance of becoming a sort of popular psychology. Although some people like B.F. Skinner had ambitions in that direction, but it's never going to work because of this sort of no talk rule if you weren't doing it right about phenomenal experience, which is not at all the point of some later people who are called philosophical behaviorists who acknowledge the importance of phenomenal experience completely. So, all right, let me go. So okay, having said that, and everybody knows, okay, this is the thing that's wrong about behaviorism, and it looks like it's something that's really wrong about behaviorism. Having said that, I do want to introduce you maybe, or at least review with you, I think about 3 different metaphysical issues that we do get at here. So let's go back to the share and take a look at that. As I say, then, just summing up that the last bullet point, you've got your sort of soft behaviorism that maybe you might encounter a research scientist who might sort of scoff and say they're a behaviorist, but really, they're usually not real invested in a lot of philosophical argument. They just, are trying to be good professional investigators. The interesting stuff is in the philosophical discussion, what we call atheistic versus agnostic, or hard versus soft, or philosophical versus psychological behaviorism. That's the question as to whether or not our idea that there's a kind of inner mind that's kind of got all this kind of psychological furniture in it, but we'll talk about what this exactly means more, is what's really up for grabs. Okay. So behaviorism and metaphysics. In fact, first bullet point, I just showed you how the issue of phenomenal properties, the metaphysical problem of consciousness, is, I think, probably the major problem for behaviorism and for operationalist empiricist approaches in general. A little inside baseball, if you want to take a note, that's called the absent qualia problem. That's what you want to look at there. And that is a real problem. I personally, I'm of the view that we really need a whole nother story about phenomenal experience, and that operationalist approaches like behaviorism deal with the intentional psychological vocabulary of beliefs and desires, but not with that phenomenal category of, say, pains and sensations. So I think actually we need not one, but 2 sort of theories of mind, because I think the concept of mind is a heterogeneous concept. Again, always just doing conceptual analysis. What is it that we're referring to with this word? It's really simple as that. So as I say, we're going to look at here 3 different metaphysical problems that are brought to light by thinking about empiricism in general and behaviorism in particular in psychology. The second bullet point, then, the first one is representational theories of mind, which is a really big one because the cognitive science community, the community of experimental science, neurophysiology, across the board, we find many people very invested in representational theories. Basically, for example, if you have a functional model of, if you have a model of nervous system function that says that the nervous system is some sort of information processing device, you've got any reference to information or data moving around in the way you're describing what the nervous system does, the metaphysical argument here is that, well, if that's so, and you've still got reference to information or symbols or representations, you haven't really finished naturalizing your model of nervous system function, because a fully naturalized model isn't going to have any reference to any non-physical properties or non-physical entities. But as I'm going to show you in a little more detail in the next slide, you do actually make some reference to what appeared to be non-physical properties when you refer to mental representations. And then, there are more quotidian arguments, such as obviously you don't have any actual representations inside your head. You have brain cells humming and buzzing and doing their electrochemical thing is what you have. And so going into that then a little more in that second bullet point, we expect causal explanations. Again, this is either you don't necessarily have to expect this. Why is it relevant? We expect causal explanations in empirical science to be closed. What does that mean? That in the explanation, you're not going to have any reference to any non-physical things. So we expect our car mechanic to say, well, you need a new valve and you need a new hose, and here they are. You're going to put them in here, and that's it. They're not going to refer to any non-physical things, except maybe, as I mentioned, they're probably up in Beverly Hills. They'll do some chakra stuff for you for a lot of extra money if you wanted that. But you got the point that that representational theories of mind don't look like they're closed physical explanations of mind or theories of mind, because it looks like they refer to representations, symbols, information, and those involve us in semantic properties. First of all, look at the way that skepticism itself really is something that comes out of a kind of Cartesian representational theory of mind. The idea that there's an inner and an outer, and that it's in the inner that your experiences are being formed. And that makes that big question mark there between what it is that your mind is representing and what the external object is really like. Of course, this is the point where Kant saw a problem with empiricism, and to great effect elaborated that idea about the construction of the representation. As I say, this one in particular, the question about the ontological status or metaphysical status of representational theories of mind, is a really big one, because you just, as soon as you get into the research community, you find it's just all over the place, and that's a question, and so you'll find, say, in linguistics, computer science, all kinds of very elaborate theories of concept formations. There are different kinds of concepts of concept, and so on. And that's fine. And I'm sure that's very useful. And having a good one is better than having a bad one. But again, as long as you can't wash out that representation, it's always going to have the same problem, no matter how sophisticated it is. Maybe there's some point of physical description where physical description turns into what we think of as information, but I don't see how it's going to be. It looks to me like information is only going to exist outside the body, not the head. So, okay, just to be specific about it then, because again, we're talking about metaphysics. So we want to talk about any supposed properties that are not physical properties. I might not accept that there's any things such as non-physical properties at all. I might just say, look, the definition of a property is just a physical property. But the way that we talk, I mean, we attribute all sorts of different kinds of properties to things. So here are these semantic properties. What are they? What is semantics? Semantics, the study of how a symbol or a language refers, or a linguistic object refers to things. Study of meaning. Properties, semantic properties, are properties of representations and symbols. Again, outside the body, this is not a problem, because outside the body, we have conventions. You're reading words on a page. That's a human cultural construction. It's because it's not, they don't have the magic. The words out there on the page or the screen aren't the magic things, magic, quote unquote. The magic's happening inside your head. You're the one who's attaching meaning to those symbols. So that's the second bullet point. The first and biggest issue here, the property of meaning or reference or aboutness. Because I'm not about anything, and the lamp isn't about anything, and the fly isn't about anything, and my hand isn't about anything, and my brain isn't about anything, and something happening in the left hemisphere of my brain isn't about anything either. And you might say, well, that's question begging. I mean, isn't that exactly what we're asking? But it's not question begging if, in the first place, for example, I just mentioned that we tend to think that physical explanations are closed physical explanations, that we don't countenance reference to things outside of that physical picture. You don't have to agree with that. That's just, if you want, that's the rules of the game. If you want, that's okay. That's okay. But notice the point here is just that if you say it's question begging, it's not question begging to say that I want to wash all the non-physical properties out of my description. Okay. You see what I'm doing. You might not agree with doing it. You might say, no, there's all kinds of non-physical properties all over the place. That's okay. Then the second, this is the third bullet point, we're talking about the other two semantic properties. One is having a truth value, being true or false. Again, physical objects such as myself and processes aren't true or false. Things aren't true or false, but it looks like propositions are true or false. Notice it looks then as if the truth or falsity of your belief hangs on the truth or falsity of the proposition, which is the content of your belief. if you believe that Germany is north of France, right, then if your belief is true, it's because the proposition Germany is north of France. It's a true proposition, and so on. So notice that does some very important work then, that notion that mental representation is propositional, because it gets you these semantic properties that, again, looks like brain stuff humming and buzzing and gooping around doesn't get you. And then logical relations, which is very important. Again, we have spatial and temporal relations to other physical objects and causal relations to other physical objects, physical relations, thankfully, to other physical objects, some are better than others. But, you know, if I say, why did he leave? And you say he was thirsty, we have this assumption that you and me and him all understand that if he believes that the water is down the hall and he desires that I need some water, then all other things being equal, he's going to inform the intention to go down the hall. Right? So you say it's common sense. So what it is appreciating logical relationships between the propositions. And it looks like it's the propositions that have the logical relationships. Again, notice it looks like the mental states have the intentions, beliefs, and so on, have their relations, their causal relations due to the logical relations between the propositions. Again, see how much work that's doing. But it's doing work because we don't know how to explain that work physically. No idea. So, so a big challenge here, of course, is if you were going to show that there wasn't this property of meaning, is there some other way of dealing with representation other than the property of reference, or getting rid of representation itself? You're going to have to take that to philosophy of language. I mean, it's a metaphysical problem, and if philosophy of mind has it, then philosophy of language has it too. And so all of a sudden it looks like a much bigger problem, because that means you would have to explain how language works without referring to meaning, without using the concept of meaning or reference. So how is that done? Well, Wittgenstein actually does this in what I take to be a very persuasive way. The fancy word is functional role semantics. So again, semantics, usually the meaning. Notice here what the notion of meaning has been really completely changed, not the meaning of a symbol. It's just what we are referring to meaning is what is concretely accomplished, what it is that I'm trying to do or anyone is trying to do by making the utterance. And he uses an analogy with tools in a toolbox, as well as the levers in the engine of a train. He says, look, all of these things do very different things, work in very different ways. The ergonomics of them are all the same. In the case of the examples built for the hand, the languages are using our linguistic ability to do different things, just like we use our hands to do different things. And this classical notion of representation is a sort of one explanation fits all. And that's like you can talk about how all tools function if you want, but that's not going to get you very far. You're going to pretty quickly have to start talking about the differences between tools. Notice William James said pragmatism is also an empiricist version of empiricist psychology, operational psychology. James giving us a theory of truth rather than a theory of mind, a theory of the semantics of the psychological terms. James gives us a theory of truth. Truth is what works. That is, something comes to fixation, we come to believe that it's true because it's efficacious for us. It gets good results. And notice, again, the empiricist advantage of that is detaching then this analysis of the function of language from any kind of correspondence with reality or mental representation. And what you need is simple iteration, and you're going to get a bottom-up formation based on what's effective. And of course, there are many, many other things that could be effective. You know, I mean, I'm trying to put this over. I might say about pragmatism that, you know, it seems to me that the reason that believing in a proposition has instrumental utility is because the world is like that. I mean, I think there's another step of analysis. So, I mean, I have my doubts about pragmatism, but I'm just pointing out to you right now that pragmatism is another example of an empiricist, operationalist kind of psychology. Third bullet point, as I was saying, then you can get rid of references to inner states and properties. At the beginning of the 20th century is very different from where we are now. People also had the practical matter that they really had not much of a way of looking at anything happening inside the brain. functionalism today reflects the fact that we can talk about some things going on inside the body, inside our model. Behaviorism just wanted to get rid of that on the grounds that it's just not going to be possible to do that. So correspondence theory of truth, if you get rid of that, then you don't have that skeptical problem about whether or not your beliefs are corresponding to some reality. I've been talking about that in a couple of the other recent videos about the common world and about Wittgenstein on solipsism. And semantic properties are eliminated if you can eliminate representational theory of mind. They go poof, and you've got, because it looks like functional role semantics does give us, and I think a more sort of plausible natural history also of the evolution of language. All right, so another metaphysical problem is the problem of rationality. I just talked about that. The problem we just talked about, the problem of mental states seemingly to have the property of reference or being about things, is usually what people mean by the problem of intentionality. I might have mentioned that. And I have another video on the problem of intentionality in this series. Here's another problem, the problem of rationality. I'll state it in a way, I'll state it in I guess it's most, as far as for me, it's technical point, which is we don't have the physical criterion to establish the necessary and sufficient physical properties that any physical object would need to have. That is to say, to be rational, that is to say, we can't fix the extension of the set of rational beings with a physical criterion. And so that's the metaphysical problem, for what it's worth. It's not as pressing a problem as the problem of representation, right? But it's a really central thing to philosophy, Plato and Kant, for example. So just to make sure everyone understands what I'm saying here, you have a human, you have an alien from outer space, you have a dolphin, and you have an intelligent android. We are describing and predicting their behavior in intentional terms, in terms of beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, and so on. And we are not incorrect, because these are minimally autonomous, minimally self-interested, minimally rational beings, and they're behaving in this way. So it looks like these intentional descriptions then are transcendental. Let's use the old-fashioned word transcendental. So functionalism, second bullet point, is an empiricist refinement of behaviorism. Behaviorism, remember, defining intentional states in terms of dispositions to behave. Functionalism, defining mental states in terms of their function. So as that sounds fancy, just think of two definitions of a doorstop. So a physical definition might be a little brown rubber wedgy thing, but a functional definition of a doorstop would just be anything that holds open the door. Okay, a rock or a book or anything. It doesn't, see, it abstracts away from hardware that way. So think about, in psychology then, thinking about a functional psychology, one that didn't mention any hardware, any particular kind of body, but just talked about rational, self-interested, autonomous beings. And they, I think, will necessarily take intentional predicates. What does that fancy language mean? That I'll start to talk about them in terms of their beliefs and desires and hopes and fears. Last bullet point. And it sounds far out, but think about the example. A spaceship lands and the space aliens come out and we see them. We don't know what they are. We don't know if they're alive or not, remote controlled or not. We don't know if they're made out of parts or just the same stuff all the way through. We don't know anything about them physically at all. If they start to behave in the appropriate ways, we're going to start making intentional attributions to them. We're going to start talking about their beliefs and their desires and their hopes and fears. We're going to read those off of their behavior because that's what we do. That's how that works. So you see then, it looks as if rationality is is a problem for metaphysics. I think, what does behaviorism tell us about that? Well, remember, behaviorism just would define rationality in this functional way. That is, the behaviorist is going to go for that kind of transcendental definition of rationality, which is also, not only then will the behaviorist be the one who can deal with the rationality of the intelligent alien, but also with the qualitative consciousness of the non-linguistic animal, actually, for the same reason. Something to think about. And then finally, I start off by showing that consciousness looks, and in some ways is a sort of problem for behaviorism. I think the moral of the story is that operationalist approaches can't deal with consciousness. You've got to say something else. Nonetheless, I think empiricism can say something about the metaphysical problem of consciousness. So, so I started off by giving this problem. I think it was sort of the Adam Sandler problem, right? Because Adam Sandler is always pretending in his movies people are stepping on his foot or he's walking to the door. So we started by noting that a basic problem is that if you define pain as wincing and crying and so on, it doesn't work because the rest of us, common sense people, are going to say, no, it's the feeling of pain that's causing those behaviors. But let's look at that insistence of empiricism on experience in another light. I mean, think of the skeptic, again, the skeptic saying that we don't know about the external world. And Berkeley says, for example, says, well, you say that the thing you experience is your mental world. And then you're all worried about this material world, this physical world that you say you don't have access to. But if you're an empiricist and you think knowledge is based on experience, then that talk about that real external world is some kind of speculative chatter, some kind of empty talk. So then if that's true, then, so if, say, the phenomenal world, your phenomenal world, again, I do talk about this a couple other places, your phenomenal world is the world of those qualities for you. And so then if you say, well, what are phenomenal properties then in the world? Phenomenal properties aren't in the world. You know, you are having experience of the world. Your experience of the world, if you want, is all phenomenal. But that doesn't mean that that's another metaphysical problem. Your experience is your experience. Wittgenstein says the world and I are one. And again, this is the teaching, for example, of Zen, of Dogen in the Shobogenzo. Okay, is that the last one? No, it's not. So empiricism and metaphysics, then, I think this is summing up. David Hume thought, like a lot of modern philosophers, that he was announcing sort of the end of metaphysical speculation. And Kant also, and Wittgenstein both thought the same thing, that properly understood, you could see the traditional metaphysics had come to an end because we've become more self-aware. But in fact, the last 75 years, roughly, I'd say since about 1950, something like that, we've had this incredible flowering of metaphysics in the English language philosophy. I tend not to categorize philosophy beyond language. I think philosophy is like a sort of kind of literature. So you have the English language philosophy, the French language philosophy, the German language philosophy. That's kind of just the way that I look at it. Same way I look at literature. So anyway, but in this English language philosophy, you've had this incredible renaissance of metaphysics. I got into it because I was interested in the metaphysics of mind, the mind-body problem. But then I realized that I had to take on board a bunch of metaphysics to be able to keep up with the conversation. And I'm not alone. I mean, because philosophy of mind has really been what you call first philosophy. That just means, that's a philosophy term that just means one of the main central concerns of the community at that time. So in the beginning of the 20th century, philosophy of science was real first philosophy for a lot of those so-called positivistic philosophers. Nowadays, philosophy of, well, the last 50 years or so, philosophy of mind has been up. And it's been a very fertile and vital area, and especially in its interdisciplinary aspects. So it's something that I encourage people to look at. Yeah, that's it. Okay. So let me just step out real quick again. Again, the intention here just to show you maybe a little more technically, or maybe to a little greater depth, how there are real philosophical issues, specifically metaphysical issues, that empiricism in general and behaviorism in particular do get to, and again, specifically issues in the philosophy of mind. So as in a lot of these videos, my goal here is really to increase your just understanding of that, just so you see what it's about. And so I hope that we made some progress. And thanks for watching very much. Okay, I'll see you later.